On a cold February morning in 2010, the town of Carlton, Pennsylvania, awoke to the shocking news that Evan Harper, a 19-year-old newlywed, had been found dead in the lavish home of his 68-year-old bride, Margaret Stinson. What appeared to be a tragic accident soon unraveled into a twisted tale of manipulation, obsession, and murder. In the early summer of 2009, Evan Harper found himself stuck in the same small town he'd always known. Carlton was the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, where secrets didn't stay hidden for long, but Evan had always been a bit of a mystery to the townsfolk. He was the quiet kid from the edge of town, living in a worn-down house that had seen better days. His parents were more like ghosts in his life, seldom around and even less involved in his upbringing. This lack of attention left Evan to fend for himself, to grow up faster than he should have. At 18, Evan felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had dropped out of high school the year before, in 2008, with no clear direction in life. He took up odd jobs, anything that would keep the lights on and put food on the table. But these jobs didn't pay much, and they certainly didn't provide a sense of purpose. Most days, Evan felt like he was running in circles, chasing a way out that never seemed to materialize. One day in June 2009, while delivering groceries for a local store, Evan was sent to the grand mansion on the hill, the Stinson estate. It was a sprawling, opulent place that stood in stark contrast to the rest of the town, with its meticulously kept gardens and towering iron gates. The mansion had been a point of curiosity for years, especially since Margaret Stinson, the widow of a wealthy businessman, lived there alone. When Evan rang the doorbell that day, he didn't expect much. A quick exchange, maybe a tip if he was lucky. But when the door swung open, he was greeted not by a housekeeper or a butler, but by Margaret Stinson herself. She was dressed in an elegant silk robe, her silver hair perfectly styled. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, locked onto Evan immediately. Margaret was 68, a woman of considerable means, and someone who had grown used to getting what she wanted. The death of her husband nearly 10 years prior had left her with more money than she knew what to do with, but also a deep, unacknowledged loneliness. As she looked at Evan, something stirred in her, a desire to reclaim some of the youth she felt slipping away with each passing year. For Evan, this encounter was like stepping into another world. Margaret was everything his life wasn't: wealthy, powerful, and seemingly in control of everything around her. When she smiled at him that first day, it was as though she was offering him a lifeline, a way out of the drudgery of his everyday existence. She insisted he stay for tea, a request that felt more like a command. Over tea, they talked about trivial things at first: the weather, the town, the grocery store. But it wasn't long before Margaret began to pry into Evan's life, asking about his family, his future, his dreams. She seemed genuinely interested in him, and for Evan, who was so used to being overlooked, this attention was intoxicating. As the weeks went by, Margaret found more reasons to have Evan come to the estate. If she wasn't ordering groceries, she was asking for help with small tasks around the mansion. Changing a light bulb, moving furniture, or fixing a leaky faucet. Each time he came, she would find a way to keep him there longer, to draw him deeper into her world. By July 2009, what had started as simple errands turned into long afternoons spent together, where Margaret would lavish Evan with praise, gifts, and the kind of attention he had never known. To the townspeople, it was clear something unusual was happening, but they couldn't quite put their finger on it. Rumors began to spread about the young man who was always seen coming and going from the Stinson estate. Some said he was hired help. Others whispered that there was something more to it. But no one could have imagined what was really going on. By late August 2009, the relationship between Evan and Margaret had taken a decidedly romantic turn. Margaret had showered him with gifts, new clothes, a shiny new car, even a trip to a luxury spa. For Evan, who had never had much, it was like a dream come true. He didn't see it as manipulation. He saw it as someone finally caring about him, someone giving him the life he had always wanted. When Margaret proposed marriage in early September 2009, Evan was stunned. He hadn't seen it coming, but the idea of marrying into wealth and comfort was too tempting to resist. He was only 19, but the prospect of escaping his old life was too strong. On September 15th, 2009, they were married in a private ceremony at the Stinson estate. The ceremony was small, with only a few of Margaret's closest acquaintances in attendance. There were no friends or family there for Evan, just the cold, hard gaze of the few people who had come to witness this odd union. In the weeks following their wedding, Evan began to see a different side of Margaret. She became more controlling, more demanding. The gifts continued, but they came with strings attached. She dictated how he dressed, where he went, and who he could see. His life, once full of freedom, became a tightly controlled schedule dictated by Margaret's whims. Evan quickly realized that he was not a partner in this marriage. He was a possession. Margaret ensured that Evan was cut off from his old life. She discouraged him from seeing his few remaining friends and isolated him from the world outside her mansion. Calls to his parents went unanswered, either because they weren't around or because he had nothing to say. Evan felt the walls closing in, but he was trapped. The life of luxury he had been promised was nothing more than a gilded cage, and Margaret held the key. By December 2009, Evan's desperation was palpable. He confided in Sarah DeVille, an old friend from high school, about his fears and regrets. Sarah was one of the few people he still trusted, and she could see the toll the marriage was taking on him. She urged him to leave, to find a way out before it was too late. But Evan, now dependent on Margaret's wealth and afraid of what she might do, felt there was no escape. The love and affection he thought he had found were revealed to be nothing more than a facade, masking a life of control and domination. As Christmas 2009 approached, the tension between Evan and Margaret grew unbearable. Margaret's demands became more erratic, her behavior more unpredictable. She accused Evan of being ungrateful, of plotting to leave her. The mansion, once a place of opulence and comfort, became a prison. Each room echoed with the silence of Evan's growing despair, and each day felt like a battle for his very sanity. By the time New Year's Eve, 2009 came, Evan was a shadow of the person he had been just a few months earlier. The once quiet, hopeful young man was now a prisoner in a life he had never truly wanted. The isolation, the control, and the constant fear of Margaret's wrath had taken their toll. And as the clock struck midnight, welcoming in the year 2010, Evan Harper knew that something had to change. But he had no idea how much worse things were about to get. As the winter of 2010 wore on, the tension inside Margaret Stinson's mansion reached a boiling point. The once grand estate, filled with luxury and elegance, had become a pressure cooker of paranoia and resentment. Margaret had grown increasingly suspicious of Evan, her much younger husband. She became convinced that his quiet demeanor and recent attempts to reconnect with old friends were signs that he was planning to leave her. The thought of being abandoned, especially by someone she believed she had saved from a life of poverty, was unbearable for Margaret. By the night of February 3rd, 2010, Margaret's paranoia had spiraled out of control. She had been watching Evan closely, noting every phone call he made, every time he left the house. That evening, Margaret confronted Evan in a rage, accusing him of betrayal. The atmosphere was charged with tension, and Margaret's voice echoed through the empty halls of the mansion as she unleashed her fury. She berated Evan for his perceived disloyalty, her anger fueled by the fear of losing control over him. The argument quickly escalated, with Margaret growing more unhinged with each passing moment. Evan, who had been living under Margaret's thumb for months, was caught off guard by the intensity of her accusations. He tried to reason with her, but Margaret was beyond listening. In a moment of uncontrollable rage, she grabbed a heavy marble statue from a nearby table, a statue that had once been a symbol of her refined taste and wealth, and swung it at Evan. The force of the blow was enough to kill him instantly, the statue striking his head with a sickening thud. For a moment, there was silence. Margaret stood frozen, staring at Evan's lifeless body sprawled on the floor. The reality of what she had done began to sink in, and panic set in almost immediately. She knew that no one would believe this was an accident, given her reputation in the town and the obvious injuries Evan had sustained. Margaret, always calculating and quick to act, decided she had to cover up the crime. Margaret's mind raced as she devised a plan to stage Evan's death. She dragged his body, now limp and heavy, to the grand staircase in the mansion's main hall. Every step echoed in the quiet house, and the weight of her actions pressed down on her with each movement. She positioned Evan's body at the foot of the stairs, arranging him to make it look as though he had tripped and fallen. She carefully placed the marble statue back on the table, wiping away any traces of blood, and then took a deep breath to steady herself. At 9:30 p.m., Margaret made the call to 911, her voice trembling as she reported that her husband had suffered a terrible fall. When the paramedics arrived, Margaret played the part of the grieving widow, clutching her chest and feigning shock. The paramedics worked quickly, but it was clear that Evan was already gone. They confirmed his death on the scene, and soon the police were called to investigate. On February 4th, 2010, the police launched an investigation into Evan's death. At first, it appeared to be a tragic accident. The staircase was steep, and the idea that Evan might have slipped seemed plausible. However, Detective Robert Jenkins, a seasoned investigator with the Pennsylvania State Police, was assigned to the case, and he quickly noticed that something wasn't right. Jenkins had been in law enforcement for over 20 years, and his instincts told him that there was more to this story than met the eye. As Jenkins began his investigation, he interviewed those who knew Evan and Margaret. He spoke to neighbors, acquaintances, and the few people who had been close to the couple. What emerged was a disturbing portrait of Margaret as a controlling and manipulative woman, someone who would stop at nothing to maintain control over her life and over Evan. People described how Margaret had become increasingly volatile in the months leading up to Evan's death, how she had isolated him from his friends, and how she seemed obsessed with the idea that he was planning to leave her. Jenkins also discovered that Evan had been reaching out to old friends in the weeks before his death, trying to rekindle relationships that Margaret had cut off. This was a red flag for Jenkins, suggesting that Evan was indeed planning to escape his life with Margaret. The detective's suspicions grew, and he knew he needed more concrete evidence to prove that this was no accident. On March 6, 2010, Jenkins received the results of the autopsy, which provided the breakthrough he needed. The medical examiner's report was clear. The injuries Evan sustained were inconsistent with a fall down the stairs. The blunt force trauma to his head indicated that he had been struck with a heavy object, not the kind of injury typically seen in an accidental fall. This was the confirmation Jenkins had been waiting for, and he immediately sought a search warrant for Margaret's home. On March 8, 2010, the police returned to Margaret's mansion with a search warrant in hand. The search was thorough, with officers combing through every room, every nook and cranny of the sprawling estate. In the library, Jenkins found what he had been looking for, the marble statue, which still bore traces of Evan's blood. The evidence was damning, and Margaret was arrested on the spot, charged with first-degree murder. The trial began on June 1st, 2010, and it quickly became the talk of Carlton and beyond. The case drew attention not just because of the crime itself, but because of the bizarre circumstances surrounding it. The massive age gap between Margaret and Evan, the strange dynamics of their marriage, and the brutal nature of the crime. The courtroom was packed with spectators, and the media covered every twist and turn of the proceedings. The prosecution, led by a determined district attorney, argued that Margaret had lured Evan into the marriage with promises of wealth and comfort, only to kill him when she believed he was trying to leave her. They painted a picture of Margaret as a cold, calculating woman who couldn't bear the thought of losing control. The prosecution presented the evidence clearly and methodically. The autopsy report, the witness testimonies, and, most damning of all, the blood-stained statue. On the other hand, the defense tried to portray Evan's death as a tragic accident. They argued that Margaret had no reason to kill Evan, that she was deeply in love with him, and that she was devastated by his death. Margaret herself took the stand, speaking in a calm, measured tone, as she recounted her version of events. She portrayed herself as a heartbroken widow, insisting that she had nothing to do with Evan's death. But the jury wasn't swayed by Margaret's performance. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and it didn't take long for them to reach a verdict. On June 20th, 2010, after just 3 days of deliberation, the jury found Margaret Stinson guilty of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial ended, but the story lingered in the minds of the townspeople. Margaret's mansion, once the grandest home in Carleton, stood empty and decaying, a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded there. Evan Harper's short, tragic life became a cautionary tale, a story that would be whispered about in Carleton for years to come. The town of Carleton was left reeling from the scandal. Evan's tragic death and the shocking trial exposed the dark undercurrents of power and manipulation that can exist in even the most unlikely relationships. The case became a cautionary tale, a reminder that not everything is as it seems behind closed doors. Margaret's mansion, once the epitome of luxury, was abandoned and left to decay, a haunting reminder of the events that had unfolded there. As for Evan, his story became a legend in the town, a sad, lonely boy who was lured into a deadly web of deceit and control. The whispers of his fate lingered long even after the trial ended, serving as a warning to those who think money and fame can provide them with the security they need. There are even some who think their faith, the God they believe in, can save them from their evil actions. And we have such a case where housewife seduces priest into secret affair that ends in murder. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more.